As I have studied journalism around the world, I have been greatly humbled by the level of courage and commitment displayed by journalists outside the U.S. Because most of them write in another language, I cannot testify to their level of writing and interviewing skills. But as for their heroism, I find it difficult to find comparisons since the very earliest days of the American Revolution. Consider the staff of the Novaya Gazeta in Moscow. 4 journalists from that twice-weekly newspaper were murdered in less than 8 years. After the third murder, that of their star reporter, Anna Politkovskaya, editor Dmitry Merlatov met with the remaining reporters and suggested they close their doors. No story was worth dying for, he said, but the reporters wouldn't let him do it. They would not dishonor the sacrifice of their friends and colleagues. That was Anna's attitude, too. She, more than any other member of the staff, had the means and opportunity to leave at any time. She was born in the U.S. to Soviet diplomats. Her birth in America qualified her to be an American citizen. So at any time, she could have left Russia to continue her anti-corruption campaign from a position of safety across the sea. Anna had already established her credentials as one of the great journalists of the world, winning international prizes nearly every year. Under the corrupt Russian government, she and the rest of the Novaya Gazeta had to come up with such compelling evidence that judges and prosecutors could not ignore it. Working under these kinds of journalistic requirements, she was still able to force the conviction of 20 men in 15 separate corruption cases. Few journalists in history can tout such compelling results. She had gained such notoriety from her work that many readers referred to the Novaya Gazeta simply as Anya's paper. Yet in some cases, her compelling evidence was not enough. Anna showed that in some locations in his last election, for example, more people voted for former Russian President Vladimir Putin than there were registered voters. The election was a fraud, she said, but nothing could be done. The death threats Anna was receiving were finally too much for her husband to withstand. He finally packed his bags and left. "I can't take it anymore," he told her. Soon after that, she found out she was going to become a grandmother. Certainly these events gave her reason to take her work overseas. She could have made a fortune writing books, teaching at a top university, and speaking to hundreds of thousands of people in the lecture circuit, and still pursue her life's mission as novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn did from America. However, Anna loved her country too much to leave. She valued truth and hated evil too much. She told a friend shortly before her death that it was precisely because of her children and her future grandchildren that she could not walk away from the fight against corruption and despotism in Russia. Every day, the Gazeta journalists go to battle, armed with nothing more than a pen and a keyboard. Unlike soldiers in an army, they have no weapons of self-defense. They do their work each day without body armor, without protection, without armed comrades around to protect them, and knowing that their odds of survival are perhaps less than those of soldiers in any war in the past century. Finally, on October 7th, 2006, Anna's battle came to an abrupt end. An assassin shot Anna in her apartment building's elevator as she was going home. With Anna's example, it is understandable why other journalists of the Novaya Gazeta refused to quit. But that doesn't make their courage and commitment to truth any less compelling. And the fact that Anastasia Barborova had never known Anna personally and had only worked at the Gazeta less than 4 months before she was shot down in broad daylight, January 20th, 2009, makes her sacrifice no less remarkable. Before such heroes, not just the journalists of the Novaya Gazeta, but journalists throughout the world who face such danger. Journalists like Olgaisha Marshanova, who was kidnapped in Almaty, Kazakhstan in 2007 and is presumed dead after she refused to quit writing about the dangerous conditions of minors in this country and other controversial topics. Before such heroes, I feel so humble. Around the world, 888 journalists like Anna and Anastasia and Olgaisha have been killed between 1992 and 2011. In fact, the Committee to Protect Journalists, which maintains these records, doesn't even count those like Olgaisha, whose bodies have never been found, but whose lives have surely been taken. So before these journalists, these martyrs, I bow in reverence, and I ask myself if I have that kind of courage to face such danger and not shrink from the field of battle. What is the value of truth to you and to me? What would we sacrifice for truth? Anna and other such journalists are my heroes. This is Ken Harvey. God bless and good day.
it's not exactly about interviewing, but it is. I mean, interviewing is how she did her job, and it is part of a journalist job. That is not to. I don't want to scare you away from being a journalist. You don't have to be a journalist like Anya. Um, like I say, I don't know that I know of any journalist like Anya who had that kind of courage and that was that effective in her work. I can't think of any. But I know, I've met journalists who have done their work good enough that they have, like I say, put people in prison and things like that, but not 20 people in 15 different cases, gathering such evidence that corrupt judges in Russia and so forth had to admit they were guilty uh, and so forth. And so, um, and then ultimately giving her life, obviously, um, is not something that occurs very often. Very rarely in America does a journalist um, suffer death if they're in America. Now there are more of them when they go out to cover a war or something than there are those who die. But I remember a number of years ago, it's been quite a while, might be 30 years, but a reporter in Arizona was murdered because he was writing about organized crime, about the mafia, basically, what we call that mafia sometimes. Um, and Anyway, so newspapers from throughout the country decided that they needed to go find his murderer. Because if the organized crime got away with murdering one reporter, that would tell them they could get away with murdering more reporters. And so there were like a dozen different reporters from a dozen different newspapers went to Arizona to try to find out who killed him. And they succeeded. And of course, working with police, the murderer was arrested, and a very strong signal was sent out to anybody who thought that journalists were fair game. If you didn't like them, kill them, sort of thing. So it doesn't happen very often in America, but it happens a lot other places. Um, and Like I said, I have to admire people who have that kind of courage, and I'm not sure that I can include myself in that group. I mean, there's been times when I felt threatened, um, but I've never been in a position like Anya was to do that on a regular basis and know that people wanted you dead. Um, she had been poisoned earlier before she was shot to death. She had been poisoned. They tried to kill her before. That's why her husband left. He didn't want to die with her. Um, anyway, I've had students ask, do you expect us to be like this? And no, I don't. Most journalists don't have to be afraid of that. They don't. There's the sort of journalism they do does not put them in the line of fire, so to speak. And there are ways, even in some place like Kazakhstan or Russia, and I don't know exactly what the circumstances are in China, so I'm not going to try to speculate, but countries where there is a strong government that doesn't want you reporting on certain things, I put it that way, um, they there are ways. I posed that question to a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist one time because I think maybe our students asked him directly. I had the interview live and then I video recorded it. But anyway, he noted that he had friends killed, not in America but elsewhere. One of his friends that was working overseas was murdered in Egypt, and he said it's hard for him to suggest that that journalists should put themselves in that situation. But he thought that in some cases you could cover an important issue without putting yourself necessarily in danger. For example, if his example. This was his example. If you know that some contractor is making a lot of money by doing by building inferior products, such as a bridge, and the bridge collapses and people die. Um, that person may be too powerful to go after him directly, but maybe you can do a story about the about bridges in general that have not been built properly, and so you don't name him by name, but you raise the issue that some construction is not being done carefully enough and maybe needs more supervision. So there might be a way to never put yourself in the line of fire directly, but still cover it. However, Ortegasha in Kazakhstan, where I used to work, she was, I'm not sure that she named names exactly. She probably named companies, but she was, her brother thinks that it was the coal industry that killed her, that she had most recently caused problems to the coal industry, talking about the dangers, to the miners who would go down deep into the earth, and how many were killed because they hadn't built their facilities properly and stuff. So she thought that, or her brother thought that it was somebody related to the coal industry, but I don't. I actually, she was kidnapped like a year before I got there, and I didn't see her story, so I don't know exactly how she wrote that. But anyway, again, for most journalists, this is not an issue. Let me pass the attendance. I will one more time pass the sheet. I think there is one person who has not signed on. If everybody has three, apparently has three members. If there is only one person who, I guess there's two possibilities. One is if there's one person who hasn't chosen a subject, if anybody wouldn't mind switching and make it two, I don't want to make somebody do one by himself. The other possibility is also that we could add them to make a fourth member to one of the subjects, so there'd be a foursome on one of them. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and pass it just so that you know. We tentatively agreed then to start on the 8th of May. That'd be the Wednesday of the fourth week. I've emailed, but I haven't had a chance to talk to Gazella. But I'm suggesting that we have only one a week. I think she's going to be doing the grading of these, so she would have to come to class at the start of class, tentatively every Wednesday starting on the 8th. We would go just one presentation a week until she takes over in week 9, and then it would double up 2 presentations a week, since she's having to grade them anyway, I think. I think that's what's going to happen. The second, well, I have your attendance here, and so sign in also to your attendance. I changed it, however, so I don't have addresses and phone numbers here this time. But instead I put down here, the wide column here is the subject you want to write about. I mentioned in class before, but let me reiterate, I don't want 2 people writing the same subject. Now that doesn't mean they can't have any relationship. I mean, after all, probably most of them will be about Xiamen University. So yeah, I'm not saying you can't write about Xiamen because one person already did. But if you think there's any chance that you're getting pretty much close, try to be as specific as you can in your subject. And if somebody, has a subject that they think is kind of different, you might consult with the other person and with me and see if it's okay to do something similar but different. I failed to stipulate that in the last class I taught, and I ended up getting well, it was a class of 96 students, I think it was, and I ended up getting like 5 or 6 stories about the same thing in some cases, and that was a waste of time. Again, your stories will be, or at least the best stories will be submitted to the student newspaper for consideration in the newspaper. So these are for real. Everything has to be accurate. Um, and you definitely don't want to get yourself in a situation where you're quoting somebody and that person says, "She never even met with me. How can you quote me?" That would be embarrassing and bad for your grade. Don't want to do that. Oh, and here's the. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to quickly finish this PowerPoint and then go to another one. Um, I'm going to only spend a second on this. These are different types of leads. Again, the lead is your first sentence. And in the way I teach it, it's only one sentence, first paragraph. So it's one sentence, one paragraph to start your story. You want them short, you want them powerful, and so forth. In my book, I explain that there are so many different ways you can write. That basically, you can start with just about anything. You can start with the who, you can start with the what, you can start with the when, you can start with the where, you can start with the how. You can start with all sorts of things. There are grammatic ways that you can start with any idea, and if you think it focuses on your whammy better, that's what I suggest. So, the example that it's very seldom, for example, that you would ever have a where, that you would emphasize the where element in a lead. But I give you an example here where I would say you could, just a few inches from freedom, a Cuban soldier was shot trying to swim to a waiting boat. Okay, so question is, where was he killed? Just inches from freedom. So it is, even things like the where element could end up being your whammy. And then the closer you put it to the front of the sentence, the more powerful it is. So that's what this page demonstrates. However, with that, notice there's one here called the interview lead. And this class is about interviewing. So I would suggest that most of you, and this, by the way, is what I put into the critique sheet, what I demonstrated in the critique sheet specifically, because that was also true for the students in the other class I was teaching, that you're going to, since your stuff is based on interviews, what I would suggest is to use the interview lead, and what you're doing is saying you're trying to focus on what was said that was really interesting, and then put the source at the back of it. So we don't want it to be a long lead. Again, we don't want to bury the source. And normally, what did I say? For most paragraphs in the story, where does the attribution to an indirect quote go usually? I told you the other day. We talked about type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1, the attribution goes to the front. And that's usually within the story, an indirect quote like number, whatever it was, where is it, number 7 up here. An indirect quote throughout most of the story, you would put the attribution at the beginning. But this is your lead. And so you want it to be as powerful as possible. So in the lead, I reverse that instruction. For the lead, if you use an indirect quote, which is what I suggest as an interview lead, an indirect quote, I would suggest you make it very short, very powerful, and put the attribution at the end, so that it doesn't get too confusing to the reader that the attribution is at the end and not at the beginning, but nonetheless emphasize what's important, which is not the person, not who said it, but what was said. So number 7 up here, interview. Tampa is lucky to be rid. That should be of there. Should be rid of former Mayor Dick Greco, his successor says. That was basically the lead I actually wrote. The mayor of Tampa quit to go into make more money in private enterprise. And so the chairman of the city council automatically became mayor. And this was his first interview, and he immediately put his foot in his mouth. Because even though he had resigned to make more money, the former mayor's real name, well, was Dick Greco. Sometimes I change names to protect the innocent or whatever. But Dick Greco was very popular. And I don't think too many people held it against him that he would accept a job that would make him 3 times as much money or something. So the new mayor, who was not that well known, not that well beloved, not nearly as dynamic as the former mayor, should not have said that. Anyway, so that became the lead to my interview with him. So the suggestion again is that you use what's called up here the interview lead, but there are lots of leads that you can use, and that's what this slide shows, but I'll just leave it at that. I suggest the interview lead for what you're doing. This, it's down here. Again, I kind of, well, I wanted to show you kind of the rest of the story here that I showed you this lead before and showed you another lead that was not as good because it was too wordy. And so this is basically breaks in half the long lead that we saw the other day. So the first, the lead itself is the achievement gap is closing in Washington State, says the State Migrant Education Program Director. Then the second paragraph contains that other information. But education reform in the state is helping all classes of students do better on the state's WASL assessment as a test, a state test, Dr. Richard Gomez says. And then I talked about the bridge. So the third one, so the bridge was basically the paragraph that I took the lead from, but the lead was was not a direct quote, it was an indirect quote. So the lead's an indirect quote. The direct quote I used was all the ethnic groups closed the achievement gap between themselves and white students in last year's statewide WASL test, he says. White students grew also, but ethnic students grew more. So basically, I found the most interesting paragraph from what he told me. I basically summarized it, used that as an indirect quote for the lead, and then I used the direct quote as my bridge into the rest of the story. So while, again, then the next, I just start going into the body. While there are admitted glitches in the No Child Left Behind program and in the WASL test, the improvement in state scores over the past 4 years show current programs are working well, says the state superintendent of public instruction, Terry Bergeson. So again, that's what I think was the last thing I was talking about the other day, is how to fairly easily start your story. And the start is the hard part. The start of your story is the hard part. So if you have a formula, I told you on the first day, I think, that I basically was strong in math and science and not so strong in writing. So what did I do when I became a writer? I made myself a formula. And so that's kind of my formula. So again, we already talked about it. So that's my formula for very quickly jumping into the first few paragraphs of a story. I find the whammy. I find a direct quote when possible. It doesn't always exist, but when possible, I find a direct quote that is the most interesting direct quote in my notes. I summarize it and make it an indirect quote for the lead. I know then the direct quote is going to be my paragraph 3. In between paragraph 2, I'm giving some more information to make the complete lead. Paragraphs 1 and 2 are the complete lead, giving you as much of the 5 W's as possible. And then you just start going back and forth, some summary and then direct quote, some more summary, another direct quote, and just interweave your story. And we'll go a little bit more into that later. So this is what we did talk about this the other day. So the lead, complete lead, the body begins with the bridge. And then you interweave the direct quotes and indirect quotes. I think this is basically the same. So I just amplified on what I just said a little bit. So this one has some more information at the bottom, but I guess part of, I mentioned on an earlier slide, it said interweave direct quotes and indirect quotes. The indirect quotes become summary for you. They kind of summarize what the person said, and then the direct quote gives you the exact words. So if you look at the last two paragraphs here, and first off, we know that the bridge, paragraph 3, is basically the expanded version of the lead. We already know that. So then in here I have in paragraph 4, the number of white fourth graders passing the Wassels reading test in 2004, for example, increased by 6.8%. American Indians, 7.5%. African Americans, 9.5%. Asian Pacific, 10.2%. And Hispanic, 12.6%. Direct quote. The improvement in student scores shows current programs are working well, says State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Terry Bergeson. So that's how, when I have enough quotes, and especially what you guys are assigned to do, you should, I do that. I just interweave a summary, then a direct quote, summary, direct quote, summary, direct quote, and it flows very easily then in making a story. Just like those last two paragraphs, just give some summary type information, which is an indirect quote or paraphrase, and then a direct quote, and then another indirect quote or paraphrase. Again, indirect quote and paraphrase about the same. You don't need to worry about the difference. And just weave back and just weave those together, indirect quotes, direct quote, indirect quote, direct quote, and it'll flow very easily through the rest of the story. As a, well, I just had a different direct quote in the bottom of this one, I guess. So same paragraph. I actually added another paragraph in there someplace. But anyway, we had those statistics like I had in the last example, and then just use a different direct quote at the very bottom. Bottom line, we had good growth in the achievement gap at closing. Dr. Gomez says it is good, but it will take more years of the same to completely close the gap. So it's not always exactly as you weave back and forth. The summary is not always exactly saying the same thing as your direct quote, but they weave together. They weave together in a way that makes your story flow smoothly and easily and cohesively. I mentioned the other day, art is really important. So this was a conference I went to. Again, you see the Spanish version on the left, the English version on the right. So this was a 3-day conference I went to. I probably took 400 photos to get this photo. I mean, I used other photos too. I'm just saying, I've asked you to get some art with your story. In this day and age where we have digital cameras, this wasn't the same when I first started my career. We didn't have digital. We didn't really have good digital cameras for professional use until the late 1990s. But we haven't had good digital cameras, professional level digital cameras for basically 20 years is all. There were digital cameras before that, but they weren't good enough for newspaper quality or magazine quality. So we were still in a period of transition in the 1990s from the darkroom development of the film and then the creation of the photos and stuff until towards the end of the 1990s, and people started using digital cameras. At first, the digital cameras that were good enough for a newspaper cost like $20,000, literally. So newspapers were a little hesitant to buy a whole bunch of $20,000 cameras for their photographers. So they were kind of waiting for the price to come down and deciding which was better. Do we keep our darkroom longer? Do we go to digital cameras now and pay all this much money? Of course, now you can pick up a camera. I mean, a lot of reporters are using their mobile phones for their cameras now. But anyway, that picture depicts the message I wanted to give with this story. But you don't come up with the right photo easily. You can't expect to go take 10 photos and come up with this photo. It's not going to happen. And so my policy for being a good photojournalist, take lots of photos and one of them is bound to turn out okay. So it's a real professional attitude. In my textbook, I illustrate the idea of simplifying your work with the example of a pitcher of juice. Let's say I bring in here this pitcher of juice. I just thought, yeah, it might be thirsty today, and I bring in some paper cups, and so I head down the row and I fill some in here. Would you like some? Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, would you like some? And then it gets down to about halfway, and we're going to run out. So I come up here and I have a big bottle of water. So I fill the pitcher again with water. So now I go down this row and I start putting some of this diluted juice to the people, and then I get down about halfway. Oh, I put some more water in. So I bring it back and I put in some more water. And so then I go down the middle row here, and people are saying, man, that's okay, I don't need any. Because I've diluted it so much that it's not worth drinking anymore. Okay? We do that sometimes with our words. We do that with our words in journalism. We don't want to do that, but we do that. Too many words can kill your writing. And so again, when I say simplify to clarify, that's one thing you want to avoid is typically that's when you find yourself in the trap of trying to sound smart. Don't try to sound smart. Try to sound clear. And clear is usually simpler words, simpler sentence structure. I mentioned before, you want to minimize, not totally delete, but you want to minimize compound sentences. Again, a compound sentence is basically two sentences with a comma in between. I mean, you have two subjects, you have two verbs, you have two objects, but for some reason you decided to make it one sentence. So usually they're joined by a word like and or but or some other conjunction like that. Avoid that. Try to keep them short throughout the story. That doesn't mean you never use a long sentence. I'm not saying that. But if you use a longer sentence, ask yourself if it helps the story or hurts the story. And if you find yourself, when you're editing your own material, like I do lots of mine, and I mentioned the other day, I like to wait a few days before I edit my own material so that I can see it with new eyes, I say. So I'm going through my story again, and if I find myself reading something twice, in other words, I read it the first time and I was confused by it. First off, I read it again and see if maybe I just misread it. Obviously, if I just misread what I said, then that's not a problem. But if I actually read it and I didn't misread it, I didn't throw in a word there or leave a word out or something, then there's something wrong. I have to think real hard, quickly, but hard, very seriously about what's wrong with this paragraph. And one of the things I'd look at very quickly is there a compound sentence here that I should split in half? That's one of the first things I'd look for. Another thing I'd look for, as I mentioned the other day, is antecedents for any adjectives or any adverbs. If it's not, antecedents for pronouns first off. Antecedents for pronouns. So if you mention two people in the same sentence, and then you say he, and they're both men that you've mentioned by name, which he is it? So look for that antecedent for pronouns. You can also have something similar with adverbs and adjectives when it's not clear who you're describing with adverbs or adjectives. So those are all things I'd look at, but I definitely would not leave that paragraph until I was satisfied that nobody would be confused like I was confused when I read it. I would not, I would not say, well, it's good enough. Oh, I figured it out in my second read. You do not wait. You do not allow your readers to have to read something twice to understand it. Don't ever leave a story where you think it's possible that a reader is going to have to read it twice to understand it. You don't want any writing like that. And so if you get stuck reading your own story, especially, and you kind of figure out, trying to figure out what I mean by this, then there's a problem. So you need to work on that. So watch out for clauses also, and some of the examples are, if you find yourself saying like due to the fact that, you can say because. So watch out for these long or phrases and clauses and stuff that don't require that aren't required. They don't add anything. So you use now instead of at the present time. You're trying to sound smart at the present time. It's now. Um, Try to actually avoid any that next one. I don't know why I put it in there, but you almost would never use the word brilliant because you have to justify that. You don't want to use an adjective that uh, that that is an opinion. I mean, it's your opinion that somebody's brilliant. That there's nobody who wins an award as the brilliant person of the year. I mean, I guess they could, but there might be somebody an award for that. But my point is that you try to avoid adjectives that require somebody's judgment. Be careful of that. Try to put facts instead. So the author of 5 books says da da da. So you put facts in there. The author of 5 books, not brilliant, because you can quantify 5 books. You can't really quantify brilliant. Again, in the next one, the work versus vocation versus employment. Just use work. It's not like the other words are that hard, but typically use the shortest, simplest word. I mentioned words of attribution, and I mentioned the other day, said is okay. And your reader won't even notice it. If every verb of attribution is said, they will not notice it. But if you start using words like opined and maintained and argued and so forth, claimed, the two problems with that. First off, it does draw attention to itself. So now they will notice it. They didn't notice it when you just said. They didn't notice that. But now when you start changing it, they start noticing it. You've now said, look at me, look at me. You've drawn attention to something that doesn't really qualify for, or is not improved by drawing people's attention to it. Your story is not improved significantly by using other words. And it can be worse. It can very easily be worse. As I mentioned the other day, the word claim comes with an insinuation that you don't believe the person. And so you are putting in your little dig towards the person you said claimed unless it is really, really, really justified. Again, if you have reason to distrust this person, or it's not so much like within your own story, you have 2 people disagreeing with each other. Well, then now maybe claimed is accurate because you have 2 even might be experts disagreeing with each other. So that would be okay to use claimed in that scenario. But be very careful of using any other verb of attribution. It doesn't, I've done this experiment before without telling what I'm doing. I have them read a story, and then I ask them what verbs of attribution do they use, and they didn't even notice. You won't even notice. If every verb of attribution is said, you won't notice. It's when you start using other verbs that suddenly you start noticing. So for a lot of newspapers in America, that's their rule. Said. That's our verb of attribution. There may be exceptions to that, even for the newspapers that say that. It's underneath my video here. But your paragraphs there's nothing wrong with a one-sentence paragraph. Again, the columns of a newspaper are that wide. One sentence is one sentence is very typically 3 lines in that narrow of a column, and so 3 lines looks fine. Doesn't look bad. In other words, actually, I said the maximum is 3 sentences. A 3-sentence paragraph in a column that narrow can look long. It can look foreboding. It can make people think twice, do they really want to read a story with these long paragraphs? It actually does cause problems. Long paragraphs, long sentences and long paragraphs lose your readers. So be careful with that. This was actually, I talked about this the other day. I mentioned that my dean back at Xiamen University in Kazakhstan, he wrote this story as a good example, he said, of public relations. But as I told you the other day, public relations should be written the same as journalism, and this is not good journalism. There's very little attribution in this. I don't want to take a lot of time with it, but there's almost no attribution. And so I did a different version of his story, and I put in attribution, and I put in some direct quotes. Even in PR, you want it to sound like a real news story because you want a real newspaper to publish it. And so to be published in a newspaper at no cost, like in America, you have to be a better writer than their reporters, basically. You have to be a really good writer to get them to run your story. And even then, they will probably assign a reporter to rewrite it and maybe ask a few more questions, but they will start with your story. My point is, no, not even in PR do you go without attribution. And not even in PR is it good to go without direct quotes. Because you want credibility and you want readability. You want to sound like a real newspaper story, so a real newspaper will run it. Okay, when we were going through the critique sheet, we talked about this. Let me just reiterate as long as I'm here. So, oops, over here. So type 1 again is usually an indirect quote. The exception I mentioned is in the lead. We want the interesting part at the start of the sentence. So in the lead, I would make the exception and say, make it short and put your attribution to the end in the lead. Elsewhere in the story, if it's an indirect quote, we want the attribution at the beginning. Dr. Gomez says, because without the quotation marks, we're not sure who's saying it until we've come to the attribution. And so we can be confused and think that the writer himself is giving his opinion until we finally get to the attribution. If it's a long paragraph, it's a long time before we get there. So the longer the paragraph, the more words there are before you get to the attribution, the bigger problem it is. So typically type 1 is an indirect quote. Typically type 2 and 3 are indirect quotes. Type 2, the attribution's at the end. But that's okay because there are quotation marks telling them that this is a quote. We'll find out who said it later. And so that's okay you're emphasizing what was said and you're telling them the source at the end. And same with type 3, the attribution's in the middle. Again, I didn't really point out very well. Let me point it out here. It's still type 3 in a paragraph if this is a comma or a period. It would be a comma if this sentence and this sentence make a compound sentence. Or in other words, if they're part of the same sentence, then that's not a period. This is a comma. And this would not be capitalized here, would not be a capital I. So this part before the attribution, this part is part of the same sentence, whether it's a compound sentence or not, then this would be a comma. In this case, this is a complete sentence, and that's a complete sentence. So your comma leads into it. Here is a comma, but here's a period before you go into the new new sentence. So that's demonstrated in the critique sheet, but that's important to know how to punctuate and handle your quotations, particularly in an interviewing class, because you have lots of quotations. Okay, I think I will stop with that one. And go to another one. Okay, well, I told you I wanted to go over what I call the 8 I's of information gathering. This is a different chapter in my book. Let me get this one, this out of the way here. I need to launch it. Okay, I don't think I had any documents posted on the Moodle site with this information, so I just put it in here and I will post it separately. So you have my phone numbers there. I have 2 coming into the same phone. I also have 2 email addresses that I check every day. I have 2 offices. My regular office will be 445, but there's no air conditioning working there now in A1, so they gave me a second office temporarily until they get the air conditioning working in 445. I'm in 405, and I do on the door of 445. I have a sign that says go to 405. There are some websites that I've created, maybe of interest to you. Okay, 8 I's. You can probably anticipate there will be something about this on your final exam. So this is a PowerPoint you want to look at a little bit in preparation for your final exam. Even though interviewing is only one of these I's, it is everything else relates to it somehow. As we go through this, I'll explain how they relate, and we'll go from there. Okay. Also, before we go into the 8 I's, somebody asked the other day, how could they improve their writing? And there are 2 suggestions. First off, one of my colleagues in Kazakhstan said his professor said, basically, to become a good writer, you have to write 1,000,000 words, and then you can become a good writer. In my surveys, I asked the editors throughout America what the students had to do to become good writers, and it became a cliche. Most of them said, or maybe not most by majority, but a lot of them said, have them write, and write some more. So basically the same thing that my friend's professor told him. You just write a lot. The more you write, the more natural it becomes, the easier it becomes. So write, and write some more. But a couple of the editors said, have them read, and read some more. And so this first website up here has the Pulitzer Prize winners. Again, Pulitzer Prize is the top award given for American journalism. But it's not just journalism. They also give a Pulitzer for fiction, I think fiction books as well. So it's basically the top writing award in America. So if we were to go there, just so you kind of get an idea, it would be a good place to go. Let me see. Oh, there we're coming up. So this goes back for many years. So if you want to read some award-winning reporting, this is a good place to go. 2019 has already been awarded. You see they have different categories: public service, breaking news reporting, investigative reporting, explanatory reporting, local reporting, national reporting, international reporting, feature writing, commentary, criticism, editorial writing, opinion writing, editorial cartooning, so it's not just writing, breaking news photography, feature photography, and then in the fiction area, they have fiction, drama, history, and biography, and so forth, poetry. And when you click on one of the winners, like this one here, it will take you to a site where you can see their stories that they submitted. So you actually see that They wrote like 20 stories here that related to their award. So this was a newspaper. You may have, like a year ago or so, there was a mass shooting at a school by one of the students, and it became a really big deal in America and became the center of controversy over whether guns should be taken away from people, or whether there should be whether teachers should be able to if they're trained and so forth, they should be able to take a gun with them, or there should be armed guards at schools. Anyway, lots of arguments over how to handle that situation, because it's not the first time that somebody has done that at a school. Um, and so this is a whole series of stories on that subject. As I told you the other day, yesterday, I guess it was, that's frequently the case, is that it's not based on just one story. It's based on a series of stories. So you can go in and read any one of these stories. This was the first one, right after it occurred. Okay. Anyway, so that's a good place. If you want to read some more good journalism, that would be a good place to go. However, be aware that it's not necessarily how good of a lead they wrote. They may have won the prize more for their reporting than for how they wrote it. But nonetheless, their writing must have been pretty good for them to win the award. So they're not. The award isn't exactly for their writing. It's for their writing, their reporting, their interviewing, everything that they did to report on this issue. So I will. So that's again in the PowerPoint. I gave you that link there. There's some other links if you can watch these on your own. I may be watching them in class, but here are 4 videos about reporting, at least, or about, well, this one here, yeah, this is one I did myself, not with video. So basically it's PowerPoints and the audio. I did an audio interview with Jim Polk, a Pulitzer Prize winner. So that's one we might listen to in class. In fact, I might very well watch that next week, because one of the things he talks about, he won his Pulitzer Prize as a newspaper reporter. And then as soon as he won his prize, NBC, I think it was, one of the major TV networks in America, came to him and said, anyway, he has a real deep voice, so I think they probably were attracted to his voice. They said, hey, how would you like to do investigative reporting for the TV network? We haven't really done good investigative reporting in the past. You can help us do this. And so he talks about his transition from being a newspaper reporter to being a TV reporter. And so that one I may listen to in class next week. The other ones are shorter. Well, the next two, Bob Woodward was a Pulitzer Prize winner, was one of those who actually both Polk and Woodward won Pulitzer Prizes based on investigating what's called the Watergate the Watergate controversy, whatever, where ultimately President Nixon had to resign. Katie Couric hasn't won any Pulitzer, I'm sure of that, but she's a good TV reporter, and she talks about how to do a good interview. So that's a good one. I might ultimately get to that one. Not real long, but if you're trying to get kind of a head start, that would be a good one too. The Dan Mothrup one, the last one, was for TED.com, TEDx actually. It really didn't introduce him, but I'm presuming he's a reporter or a writer of some kind. He's talking about basically talking about interviewing. That is the subject of what he's talking about. And so with all the examples he gave, I'm presuming he's a reporter, but I didn't actually see it describe where he's coming from. And that one's longer, that's like 20 minutes or so. Okay, 8 I's. The first one is innovating. And the idea with innovating is you've got to come up with an idea. You know, as a professional journalist, um, you have to be writing, you know, multiple stories every week, and so you're always, the idea is your starting point. You know, what do I write about next? And you have to have more than one idea because frequently you get stuck in the sense that you can't get you can't set up the interviews and the time in order to get out to the next issue of the paper. And so you say, well, then I'll postpone that one. I'll go to this other story and finish that one today. So you're typically juggling more than one story. And you know, you want to do your best one first if you can, but if you can't get the sources, you can't get the information you need, you can't set up the interviews, you go to the next one. And so how do you get those ideas? It mentions keep an idea file. Write down any ideas that may occur to you but which you have no time to pursue. So it can be, I sometimes keep like 3x5 cards so I can write down some ideas. And so that's one way of doing it. Nowadays, of course, with a computer, you could do a search better if you were in a computer. So just keep it in there. Maybe use an Excel file. That even allows you to do even a better search. There'll be lots of formats in which you can keep the idea file, but ideas are valuable. Ideas are really valuable. Have you ever, woke up in the morning or something and had a really good idea, and then you didn't write it down and you can't remember what the idea was anymore? Ideas are valuable, and if you're a reporter, especially so, because, like I said, you may be writing, multiple stories every week, and you have to have the ideas. You have to have something to start with. And so any idea that pops into your head, you should be writing that down for future reference. If you're not going to chase it right now, then write it down for your future, as a future story. Clip stories from other newspapers and magazines. If you can see some way in which you could do the story from a different perspective, attach your thoughts as to how you would approach it. In that first job I had back when I wasn't much older than you guys, I read in a national magazine that at that time we had a lot of inflation in America, and so a lot of public projects, things like bridges and highways, you would have contractors who would bid and say, I can do that bridge for whatever, $20 million. And then he'd start building it and he'd come back and say, I can't do that for $20 million. You guys got to give me some more money. If you want me to finish this bridge, I need some more money. So they were giving cost overruns to lots and lots of contractors who had agreed to do it for one price and then didn't finish it. Right now, they're talking about a fighter jet that they're building for America's military. Has already cost $35 billion and they haven't actually built any yet. It wasn't supposed to be that expensive, but it's supposed to be this next gee whiz, best fighter bomber plane in the world, and they're having cost overrun after cost overrun. So, having read this story, I decided, if this is a national problem, is it a local problem? And so I went and started talking to mayors and other local public officials and found out, yes, it was a major problem in Tampa, Florida. And so the competition had not covered that issue. And I made a series, I think, of 3 or 4 stories on that issue in Tampa. So the idea came from a national magazine. And I just asked myself, can that be localized? I was able to get some data from the national magazine and some statistics and stuff, and then come and get all the information I needed for the local story. So look for ideas where you can find them and clip those and or virtually clip it or physically clip it, put it in your idea file. Publications from other communities often provide good ideas that are applicable locally. Competing media open doors and frequently fail to pursue all the questions. So even within your community, but first off, for example, I read a story someplace, I think it was from a different side. I was working in Arkansas at the time. I had a newspaper in Arkansas, and I read a story someplace about how lots of juveniles, people underage, 16-year-olds and stuff, were buying liquor. You know, again, it was against the law. They had to be 18 in that state, I think, and they were buying it at 16 at the state-approved liquor stores. And so, again, I don't remember exactly where I saw it, but wherever it was, I decided, I wonder about that here. And so I found a young lady who was just right at the edge. She was not, she was illegal to buy. Um, so she was just a little bit under 18, I guess. And I sent a reporter out with her, and she went to 8 different liquor stores to see if she could buy alcohol. In that case, just beer. But still, that was illegal for her to buy beer. So we basically had her go in and buy a case of beer at each of the 8 stores. And then the reporter wrote down which store it came from. She went to 8 stores, and she was successful in buying liquor from all 8 stores, or beer from all 8 stores. And some of them, it's kind of interesting, some of them would look at her, some of them didn't ask for her license. Her driver's license is typically the ID that we use in America for buying alcohol. So they didn't even look at her driver's license. Others looked at it and couldn't do the math or something, so they said, okay, whatever. So they looked at the license but didn't figure out that she was underage and still sold her, but basically they all sold her beer. Then I used a technique that a friend of mine who did work for, I think I mentioned Jack Anderson, who did an investigative reporting piece every day for 900 newspapers across America, plus for a while he was doing it on TV. Anyway, a friend of mine from my university was his lead writer when I was first teaching in Buffalo, New York. And so I had him come to talk to my students. And so he shared some of the ideas, some of the things they did for their investigative reporting. And one of the things he explained to me was that if they did a bunch of investigating on, like, a congressman, somebody kind of powerful, and they were sure he had done something wrong, like take a bribe. They were sure he had taken a bribe. But they really couldn't, they didn't have everything they needed to basically put him in jail. But then what they would do is they would take all the evidence they had and they would go to the FBI and say, here's what we know about this person. Are you going to investigate, with our information, with our help, are you going to investigate this man or this woman? And if they said yes, then their story would come out. The FBI is investigating Congressman so-and-so for accepting on the suspicion of accepting a bribe. And so this protected them from saying something they couldn't prove. So they didn't say he accepted a bribe. They said the FBI is investigating him for accepting a bribe. And of course, the FBI was investigating him because of the information they gave to the FBI. So it's a way of keeping yourself out of legal problems with a story that's, you can expect trouble from. And so we did the same thing. We went to the police station, gave them our eight packs of beer, and anyway, they started their investigation. And so our story the next morning was the local police are investigating 8 local liquor stores for selling beer to a minor. Okay. Anyway, but that came from another publication. I saw that somebody else had done that investigation, and I figured we could do it at our locale too, and it turned out that definitely we could. Keep clips of good stories that you and your own colleagues have written. Again, these can be electronic format, but for 2 reasons. First off, a story that was important a year ago might have a good follow-up issue related to it. So for example, let's say there was a murder in your city. Was the person ever caught? Was he tried? If not, if it's a year later and nobody was ever caught for that murder, then it's a good story to follow up on. What happened? Where were your leads? Why haven't you found somebody? What were the difficulties you encountered? So now you have a follow-up story a year later, or however long it is before you decide to go back and revisit that issue. That was once a good story and now is still a good story to follow up on. And again, obviously, you emphasize the new information. And so in writing that, for example, your lead is new. Police still have no suspects in the murder of so-so, whatever. You have a new lead. And then in paragraph 2, you may have to review and remind people what happened. So paragraph 2 becomes a review of the old story. So anyway, a clip file for your newspaper or even for what you've done yourself can be very helpful in coming up with a new story similar to the old one or a follow-up on the old one, whatever it might be. So I'm going to review your idea file frequently to see if the time has come to pursue one. Another type of file that's similar is what I call a beggar's list. A beggar's list is all of your contacts, everybody you've talked to in the past and have some relationship with. It could also be, by the way, people you have no relationship with. But basically, the idea is a beggar's list will allow you to pick up the phone and talk to somebody and try to come up with a story idea. You have no idea what the story idea is going to be, but you know this is a person who has some credibility, and this person might be able to give you an idea. So it might be the mayor of the city. It might be a city councilman. It might be the police chief, somebody you know or you're not afraid to approach anyway, and just go in with no idea what you're going to write about. And so, you have all these, none of these other ideas worked out. You just go beg for an idea from somebody you know. So who you know sometimes is an important part of innovating and coming up with an idea. And by the way, what you find as a professional reporter is that there are some people who love being your source. They just love the idea that they're going to get their name in the newspaper, and so they want to be your best friend. And they will give you all sorts of ideas. So those ones, you don't want to overdo them. And in fact, maybe they give you the idea and they're not the main source. They may not even be in the story. You just take their idea. But they're so anxious to help you. They like that. They're part of the news business because they gave you an idea. Those people can be very valuable, sometimes a little annoying as well, sometimes a little bothersome because they talk to you too much. But they can be quite important and certainly part of your beggars list. Inquiring. Again, a lot of these do relate to interviewing. So in this case, you have to ask yourself what you need to know. Who's likely to criticize something? Who's likely to speak in defense of it? Who are the people who may have nothing to do with it but may know something about it? So inquiring is kind of a pre-interview question. And indeed, it might be kind of relates to your beggars list. It may be you go to your list of people that you already know and you kind of pick their brains a little bit. But once you have an idea, then you start coming up with who do I need to talk to? Who's going to help me do this story? Who's going to be my sources? So, and in some cases, if it's this one, I think some of the ideas here were given to me by an investigative reporter. So he's somebody that would put people in prison. So what he's saying here is that in the idea of inquiring, you may be talking to people. I kind of suggested this yesterday, but in a more serious way because you might be putting somebody in prison. you might be interviewing people all around your primary target, so to speak, until you have lots of other information, and then you can come in and ask some tough questions of the primary person. I mentioned the other day that one of the people I interviewed was an award-winning reporter for the New York Times, and so I do quote him in my book. But one of the things he said that he when he goes into an interview, and this is an interview again, his example was a union leader who was using union money to go on trips to Malaysia or someplace from America, someplace exciting like Malaysia. Um, and so he would go in and he would say, greet him and so forth. He'd talked to him before already. And, I just had a few questions for you today. And this is the guy who would not take notes, would not use a recorder. And so I just had a few questions for you. There are people that are saying that you use union money to take vacations with your mistress. What do you say about that? So you're kind of blaming it on somebody else. It's not your fault. Some people are saying this. It's not your fault. You have to ask the question. It's your job to ask the question. And so he of course denies it the first time. And so then because you've done your homework around the circle, then you say, well, yeah, I can understand why people might misunderstand, but your treasurer, the treasurer of the union, says that this was not approved. So this makes it kind of awkward. The treasurer says you use this money and it was never approved to go to Malaysia with your secretary or whoever. So how do you respond to him? That seemed kind of awkward there. And so, he tries to come up with some new answer with that. If you just kind of, you've gotten some information from the outside and you're kind of getting harder and harder and harder questions, a little bit of evidence behind them. And this was the guy that he ultimately put into prison, and the union leader sends him a Christmas card every year because he did it so gently. He trapped him so gently, he didn't realize he was being trapped, basically. Now, I'm not suggesting you should all go out and try to trap somebody here at Xiamen University, but I'm trying to explain the big leagues, so to speak. If you become a professional, how you have to approach some interviews. So it begins with the inquiring stage, where you start gathering some information before you go to your primary target to start asking questions. And there are ways of doing it so that they don't even know, as I said, that they're being trapped. Because you can be very friendly, smiling, and I sure understand what you mean by that, but you've got this other situation. So he says you have to start looking under rocks. Investigative reporting involves using standard journalism techniques over a longer period of time to raise more issues, to interview more people. We spend more time exhaustively asking questions and hope to be able to write a story telling a reader really what happened, knowing whether you're right or wrong. I always reach that point by interviewing a lot of people. That was Joe Treaster from the New York Times. So then you get to your interview. So you looked into the situation. You've talked to some other people. Maybe you've done some other sort of homework, so to speak, to find out about what questions would be good for you to ask, and then you go in and do the interview. This one, so this is basically, again, Joe Treaster, again of the Times, what I was just telling you about. He says in his words, there seems to be at least two schools of thought in interviewing. One is the tough guy, intimidator school, where these fellows manage to browbeat sources into telling them something. I never try that, he said. That's not the way I do things. I only shouted at a source once, and I didn't get a story out of him. My approach is to go into an interview situation as a very sympathetic listener. I walk in and try to loosen him up and myself. I try to show him that I'm not going for his jugular. I try to be as friendly as I can without compromising my own position. I try to create a nice, unthreatening atmosphere so he can talk. We start with real easy questions. If I know the guy is lying to me, I just make a note of it and come back later. Then I say, I heard that a little differently. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I give him a chance to back out of it. A lot of times you can kind of peel the layers of falsehood back, and gradually, by the time you leave, you have a story. So that's one angle on interviewing. This was another one by Peter Fleeth. This is the one I mentioned. Was a part of the team that did the series of stories about the family that got trapped up in the mountains in the snow, snowbound. He told me, he said, there's an arc to an interview. You want to come in and be friendly, try to get people to open up. Then as the arc goes higher and higher, you begin to mine the information you want. Between midway and 2/3 of the way through the interview, you want to hit them with the really hard questions. You want to be as mean as you're going to be. You want to ask them if they robbed the bank, basically. But by the end of the interview, you want to leave them smiling. So about 2/3 of the way through, you hit them with the hardest questions you're going to ask, and then you ask simpler questions, and you leave them feeling good. So that's his theory of interview. Not too dissimilar to Treaster's, but maybe just a little bit different than the New York type reporter, but another perspective on it. This was, I think I mentioned Charles Young was a Rolling Stone writer and editor, and he was the one did I mention him as coming right after John Belushi killed himself in drugs? That was probably my other class. I was talking my success strategies class about how people that are rich and famous are sometimes the most miserable people. They get to the top and they realize they're still not happy. They've got everything that you could ask for and they're not happy. And so they kill themselves or they drown themselves in drugs until they die, whether it's purposeful or not. Anyway, yeah, when he came to to teach my class in Buffalo, it was the day that this famous actor back in the 80s, the first Ghostbusters movie was done with John Belushi. I think there's a recent one last year or so, right? Anyway, he did the original one, and so he was a comedic actor. He was again rich and famous and everything, and anyway, the day that Charles Young came to talk to my students, he died of a massive drug overdose. Anyway, that's another story for my other class. Anyway, he being with the Rolling Stone, he did more feature stories, but even his feature stories had an investigative side to them. So I'll put it in his words here. I've done live-ins both in Harlem and Beverly Hills, with the rich and famous and with the poor and anonymous. The basic idea is the same everywhere, anywhere. You need to spend time with an individual. Spend 24 hours a day with your subject and be alert at all times. You never know when an incident will occur that will solve the subject's personality. I did a live-in in Harlem and spent all the time I could in a junior high school there. I latched on to a couple of kids. I lived in their apartments. I went to school with them. It was a completely different culture for me. I grew up white, middle class. These kids were selling heroin for their movie money. Psychologically, this technique is similar to method acting, where the actor is supposed to become the person he is playing. A journalist asks a person to take off his psychological clothes so the journalist can recreate him on paper. So this one, you probably aren't going to go spend 24 hours with a subject, but even if you spend 4 hours with a subject, this is kind of similar to my taking public officials out to lunch when I was in Tampa, and we'd spend 2 or 3 hours together, and very gradually, I would figure out, I'd go in without any idea what I was going to write about, but after an hour or so of chit-chatting over lunch, I would start finding some ideas. Start, what do I pursue? What ideas do I pursue here? And get more and more information to make a good story from. Um, and I also one of the mayors that got kicked out of office because of my writing. I just went out driving with him. He just took me out in his car and was going around the city. And I can't even remember what it was he was telling me, but he was telling me some really stuff, some stuff he should not have been telling a reporter. And I'm not going to stop doing my job just because I'm acting friendly to him and he's trying to act friendly to me. This was in Arkansas, and Arkansas politicians, they talk about in the South of America the good old boy syndrome, where the politicians want to make you one of their buddies, and they think that you're going to have then a relationship where you both benefit. You're going to promote them. You're going to make them look good, and they're going to, I was living out in a house out. It was maybe 2 miles off the highway, and it was like a dry creek bed, rocks and everything. It was ridiculous to get to my house. But I enjoyed the house where it was. I really enjoyed the house, but the road was crazy. And so I mentioned that not to this mayor, but to the county. The position they called him there was the county judge. He was the head of the county, which is a bigger area than the city. And so he sent out all sorts of bulldozers and stuff. And within within a month, it was a highway basically to my house because I was going to be his good old boy reporter. So you kind of have that situation in the south part of America. And so the mayor was kind of like that, I guess. That he just was making me one of his good old boys and started telling me stuff that was unethical, possibly illegal, I don't remember, but whatever it was enough to get him unelected the next term. And he was one of those who tried to lie and say that, that I misreported, and I had the recording and invited anybody who wanted to come listen to it to come listen to the recording. So that was similar to this. It was only a few hours. We went out driving, but in that situation where we're just being friends, one of the people I interviewed, one of the reporters, said that's basically what you're doing. You're creating a fake friendship. They know you're a reporter. You're not deceiving them. They know you're a reporter. They know you have a job, but you are trying to create an artificial friendship so they will open up and tell you things they shouldn't tell you, basically. And if they're stupid enough to do that, that's their problem. You're doing your job. You're doing your job of reporting, and you're going to use whatever they give you. And if they give you material that's going to get them kicked out of office, that's a them problem. It's not a you problem. It only becomes a you problem if you cover them up. If you go along with this good old boy thing and say, yeah, I'm not going to write about that because you're my friend and we're going to, be buddies all the whole time I'm here, then you're not a good journalist. So you have to report on what you find out. I think there were a couple of other things in the book. One of them, some of the stuff this Charles Young shared with me that were interesting. He has a technique of interviewing, and again, he's doing more feature type writing, entertainment writing, but it is investigative in a sense that he is trying to get them to take off, as he says here, their psychological clothes ahead of him, before him. And he said one of his techniques is, what's he call it? He has a fancy way of saying it. He really, it was one of the best talks I've ever heard. Anyway, I won't try to replicate it in that sense, but one of the things he said was that if you tell somebody, and this is his example, not mine. If you tell somebody about the embarrassing way you lost your virginity, the first time you had sex, then they feel compelled to tell you about the first time they had sex and the embarrassing circumstances or whatever. And of course, their story gets into your magazine and yours doesn't. Um, so it's some sort of a theory of reciprocity, that you tell somebody something and they feel compelled to tell you something. And so you can use that as a reporter to get people to tell you things that they shouldn't probably tell you. Uh, anyway, another way he said is he said it's kind of like in baseball. I don't know if any of you follow baseball here, but anyway, in baseball there are some pitchers, and he named some that were famous, that can throw a hard ball more than 100 miles an hour, which would be whether it be 150 kilometer an hour. They really throw hard, and there's others who throw really softly, but they make them curve and stuff, and they're hard to hit because they're slower and they curve and they do weird things. And so he says sometimes you want to be you want to start off like the guy throwing junk. What do you call it? The soft stuff. So like these other people were saying basically, but he was comparing it to baseball. You give them the soft stuff. And then when you get to the end, you throw the hard ball about 150 kilometer an hour right at their head, and and try to get what you need out of there. He said, however, sometimes he does just the opposite. He'll throw the hard ball right off the bat, scare the heck out of them, and then he'll do the soft stuff later. And actually, the Oregonian, the Peter Fleeth, was kind of saying the combination. He said, do soft stuff, then do the hard ball, and then end with soft stuff so that they can, okay, good, we're friends now. Anyway, those were some of the other things he was talking about. He had like 20 ideas he had that were put in very funny format, entertaining format. Investigating, it relates to interviewing in that, again, it's maybe part of that going around the circle, trying to find the information before you can actually go in for the key interview. In America, there is most states and the federal government have what we sometimes call sunshine laws, and I know that doesn't exist in a lot of countries, but basically it's in the federal case it's called the Freedom of Information Act, and there's one organization that they apply for information like every day. They're applying for new information from the federal government to try to expose some deceit in the government. And if the government refuses to give you some documents and you have evidence that there is some, you can convince a judge there is some. You can sue them, and the judge will say you have to go back and get this information for it. And so the judge becomes involved and forces the executive branch to do that. And so documents like that are really valuable to a reporter. The source on this one was a reporter for what's called the Village Voice and other newspapers, New York Daily News, New York Post, New York Sun, The Nation magazine, Jack Newfield. And he said that basically he made his career off of going to government and getting them to give him documents. I'll just read what he said. The single most important tool of an investigative reporter are documents. Documents allow you to work in detail. Documents allow you to find facts the governments and bureaucracies don't want you to know. Just about every original or important story I've done has come from documents that were public records that other reporters were either too lazy to look up or didn't know where to find. The key lesson, I guess supposed to be is to read. You have to read every piece of paper. You have to spend 2 to 3 hours a day just reading documents, reading transcripts. And so some of the stories he writes are things like the 10 worst slumlords in New York City. A slumlord is somebody who has apartments and doesn't take good care of them. So they're falling apart. They're not, lots of cockroaches and rats and whatever. Wouldn't want to live in one of the apartments that a slumlord owns. And so he can go, there are some public documents he can get access to that shows how many citations the government inspectors found in certain apartment buildings. And so uh, that's one of the things he does. Are the 10 worst slumlords in New York? Every year he goes through documents, and so the documents allow him to come to that conclusion and to give details as to what inspectors found that was icky in those apartments. Anyway, he does a lot of things, a lot of stories kind of similar to that, always based on documents. So he finds out what the law is in his case and in his city, in New York City, and in the United States. And then if there are laws that allow you to access public documents, then maybe that's something you can do. Some of you may be living places where you're not going to get any documents. I don't know. In America, it's pretty easy. But they fight. The government bureaucrats fight it. And they will say they don't have any documents. And like I say, this one organization has like 30 lawsuits going on at any one time against the government because the government says they don't have documents, and they can prove they have to have documents, that they haven't done their job. Peter Sleeth also talked about documents. Documents are an ironclad way to make your case and print it in the paper without being sued. They're critical to really good reporting. Any way you can get documents is fair game. Documents are the gold standard. I know reporters who all they did was go after documents to become great reporters. So, and that includes the previous one, Jack Newfield, would be in that category. Insisting, again, part of the interviewing. Penetrate beneath the obvious, the superficial. Few stories could not be dramatically improved with more probing questions of more people. The two key questions most frequently overlooked are how and why, detail by detail, moment by moment. How did this happen? What did you say? Recreate the scene for me. How will this affect consumers, taxpayers, business, employees, the economy, the society, the government, the future? What are the ramifications and consequences? I'm just giving you some ideas that you could, again, insisting sort of ideas, the sort of questions you can ask depending on who it is you're interviewing. How can we illustrate the problem? Give an example or two. How would you argue the case for this? How would you argue the case against it? Weigh the pros and cons. Why did this happen? What led up to it? Who's really to blame? Why do you think they're doing that? Why doesn't somebody do anything? Why didn't you do something? Why aren't you doing more now? Why are you telling me these things? What is your motivation? Lots of mostly how and why questions there that help you to penetrate and find information that they won't just willingly give you in some cases. You need to ask the hard questions, and very frequently, as illustrated here, these are just examples of how and why questions that you could ask somebody to try to dig deeper and deeper to get more information for your story. So this one I call insisting. It's still part of interviewing, but basically that word came from one of my interviewees that I talked to used that term, and so I decided to make that part of my 8 eyes. Ingesting. You have all this information. What do you do with it? You've done a good job of reporting. So what? Now you have to write it. So how do you do it? Once you have gathered the information for your story, you have to ingest it, analyze it, organize it. You have to look for gaps in your information. After you have organized your notes and are ready to write, take one more look to make sure, now that your notes are organized, whether you have failed to find an answer to any important questions. Are there holes in your story? If you have a question you need to answer, or even if you don't, it's frequently advantageous to call one or more of your key sources one more time. They may have had some new thoughts since your last conversation. The more questions you ask, the more information you obtain, which leads naturally to more complete reporting. One thing I do, the more sources I have, the more difficult it is to write your story. what the better story it is. I don't have anything to write with up here. So let me try to describe what I do. I go through my notes, and the first thing I do is I go through and designate how many topics do I have, and I mark those A, B, C, D, E, whatever many topics I've covered in my interviews. So this is subject one, this is subject two. In other words, this is subject A, this is subject B, this is subject C, this is subject D. And they're not in order. And so that's why I'm going to have to go through and I read all my notes and decide, which ones go with this subject, which ones go to that subject. And so I can, if in a computer I could put them, I'll be copy and paste and put them all in some sort of order like that. But originally they don't all come nice and neatly in order, the way that you need to have them eventually. Then once I've done that, then I go back through and now I use numbers. Out of all the quotes and all the information I have for subject A, what's the most important ones? And I don't necessarily have only one, A1. I may have 2 or 3 A1s. So, because I can, decide which one to emphasize later. But I do prioritize them, A1, maybe several A1s, maybe several A2s, and some A3s. I don't go too deep. So then, and I do that with every subject. So now I see I have these A1s, I have these B1s, I have these C1s, I have these D1s. Now out of all that, where's my whammy? I didn't, the letters haven't given any designation. I started with A with the very first subject in my notes. So that's not the point at that time. So, but once I go through all my notes and I mark them, A, B, C, D, E, and then A1, B1, C1, D1. Now I can start evaluating and deciding what is my whammy. What is, out of all those ones, and first off, which subject is the most important subject? Is it A, B, C, or D? Let's say if there's four key subjects. Which is the most important subject do I have? That's probably the one I'm going to go with. Now, out of that subject, what kind of material do I have? A1. Let's say C is my most important topic. So I look at all those C1s. Do I have good stuff here for a lead? Hopefully I do. If I don't, then I better make a phone call or send an email or something. But if I decide that C is the most important subject we talked about, I need to make sure I have a good lead. And if I haven't asked the right questions to get a good lead, I better follow up with some more questions before I write my story. Because as a reporter, I want my most important topic at the top. If you have one that complicated, which you guys may or may not have one that complicated, but if you do, now when you start writing, what are you going to emphasize in the lead? Your lead should be emphasizing, well, if C is your most important topic, your lead should be a C1 lead. That's what you should be emphasizing in your lead, C1. The one that you thought was most important and the most interesting material. A1 indicates this is the most interesting material about topic C in this example. Then in paragraph 2, you may kind of summarize some of the other stuff, topics, A and B, for example. Maybe not all of them. If you go to a city council meeting, you may have a city council agenda may have 20 items on it. There's no way you're gonna summarize all 20 items in your complete lead. But that wouldn't make any sense. Some of them are stupid. Some of them are boring. You may not even put them in the story at all, let alone put them in your complete lead. So if you really have that many topics, if you had 20 topics, you would, maybe in your complete lead, paragraphs 1 and 2, maybe even 3, you might cover 4 topics at the most. You're not going to cover all the topics. So your lead ends up being topic, your first topic, your most important topic. Paragraph 2, you might summarize 2 or 3 other topics. And then you're bridging into the body. So the bridge should be about your main topic again. So in the example, if C is your main topic, then you maybe used an interview lead, indirect quote for the or it might not. It might, in that case, it might end up being a different type of lead. But say it is an interview lead, then your paragraph 3 is going to be a direct quote reflecting back on your subject C that you consider the most important. And you will, from there, it can be a little bit chaotic, and you have to use your own innovation, your own capability to figure out how to run the rest of the story. It is the easiest way once you get past, you've already summarized the story by putting not only the lead, not only the most important topic in the paragraph 1, but you also put the second and third and maybe the fourth most important topics in paragraph 2. That summarized your story. Paragraph 3, you did a direct quote reflecting back on your most important story, and you may just go ahead and say everything you're going to say about that topic, and then go to the second most important topic, and then the third most important topic. That's the easiest way to handle it. Not try to go the most important things about topic A and the most important topics of information about topic B and C, and then go back to A and then back to B and back to C. That gets a little chaotic. So that's typically the way I do it. If I have, again, in this example, 4 topics, my lead is going to be about the most important one. I will summarize the other important ones, maybe only 2 of them, maybe all the 3 of the other topics in paragraph 2. My paragraph 3 bridges back into paragraph 1, back to the most important one, and I cover all of that I think is important, then go to the next topic, then to the next topic. It's easier to organize that way, and you've already given them a little information in the complete lead. If they're interested in some other subject, they'll keep reading until they get to the part that they want, if it's not the lead. Understand that? You have any questions on that? It gets a little complicated. If I had a marker, I could kind of show you a little bit better. But and maybe I will. Yeah, I was thinking about writing a story in front of you based on some notes that I kind of recreated from a story I wrote many years ago. And so maybe I'll do that in the next class, is write a story with you and show you my thinking process as I go through that story. Okay, so ingesting is how you do all that. Again, that is part of interviewing. You have to ingest, you have to analyze and ingest your information in order to come out with something that makes any sense. So that is part of the interview process. I mean, it would also include other documents, and anything else you have in your notes is also becomes part of this process. But if all you're doing is basically interviewing, then that you still have to do it. You have to go through this analysis procedure and figure out how to organize your story. Interpreting, this is where at the time it made sense to me, and now I'm a little concerned about it because I think too many journalists are doing this when they don't really have all the facts. And so this is where I was talking about, I think some people, they're calling them deep state. People in America, if you want to just separate it into 2 main groups, you can say conservatives and liberals. The liberals control the government bureaucracies. The liberals control Hollywood. Liberals control the news media, and liberals control academia, all the universities. Typically, in most of those cases, at least a 4-to-1 ratio between liberals and conservatives, at least 4-to-1. In Hollywood, it's more like 9-to-1. And in some universities, it can be as much as 20-to-1. 20 liberals for every conservative. And yet, conservatives win on a regular basis the elections. And the liberals can't figure out, how did Trump win? He's a conservative. He's an idiot. How did he win? The liberals do not understand the real world. Basically, the conservatives are typically people in the smaller communities. Basically, Hillary actually did get more votes, but the way it's figured in America, an electoral college, it gives every state a certain amount of weight. And so Trump won. Well, within the states, there are also counties inside the state. And then inside the counties, there are cities. And so um, Trump won 89% of all the counties in America, but he lost the popular vote. But the fact that he won so universally in the counties gave him more electoral votes, which actually then made him president. The areas that the liberals control are the cities. Liberals control the cities. The conservatives control all the rest of the country, basically. And so when you get out into the middle part of America, Nebraska, Iowa, that's all conservative country. The farmers are conservative. The small business people are conservative. The religious people are conservative. People with big families are conservative almost always. People, the more the more, you might say, the responsibilities you feel in America, the more conservative you become. So if you have a big family, if you own a business, if you own your house, you're making payments on your house, all those sorts of things tend to make people conservative. And so, like I said, Trump won 89% of the counties in America, and he actually lost the popular vote to Hillary because the cities have so many people. So geographically, he won the vast geographic area of America, and Hillary won the cities, which gave her the majority of voters. And so that's actually one of the things the Democrats are trying to do now, is do away with what's called the Electoral College, so that Hillary would have won the election. They don't want conservatives winning because they cover more geographic mass. They want the cities to control America, basically. So that's one of the next big fights that's going to come up. Okay, my point, though, getting back to this, is that because the bureaucracy, the government itself, the people who work in the government every day, the people that we call bureaucrats, they are liberal. And so they've been feeding all sorts of stuff to the New York Times and the Washington Post to try to hurt President Trump, even though he's their boss. But they are permanent and he's temporary. So what we call deep state is trying to control the government no matter who's elected. They want to control the government, and it's kind of a scary situation right now. But consequently, what we're seeing in journalism right now is the deep state, especially, is feeding information selectively to the journalist, and the journalists are writing stories very frequently, typically with anonymous sources, making claims that now, after the Mueller report came out, many of the stories have been shown to be false. They were just false altogether, but the reporters fell for it and were manipulated about it because they wanted to. The newspaper also controlled by liberals, 4-1 liberal to conservative. And so the media is controlled by the liberals, and the bureaucrats are liberals. The bureaucrats give the media the stories they want published to hurt the president, and it's just become chaos. It's become a terrible situation in my book. So I'm going to go ahead and read this and what they have to say, but especially I say it with a grain of salt. Are you sure you have the facts? Now, in these two cases, I think these guys are sure. When they write their stories, Joe Treaster's the New York Times reporter. I think he knows his facts. And Charles Young is the Rolling Stone editor-writer. I think with the sort of stuff he does, he knows his facts. But a lot of journalists are out there doing bad journalism right now, doing what these guys say you should do. But they're doing it badly because they don't have good information. So Treaster's perspective, just stacking up a bunch of facts is like baby talk. We better try to find the truth, or we might as well pack up and go home. You have to give both sides and let everyone speak, but we shouldn't stop until we know the truth. You are perfectly capable, justified, permitted, and indicted to demolish the arguments of people you are quoting if you've got the goods on them. In other words, you know they're lying to you. Politicians are very good at taking advantage of reporters who won't do that. So it's with this justification, a lot of people, a lot of the liberal reporters are doing a bad job of reporting, I think, on Trump because they want to destroy him. They are politically oriented in such a way that they feel like they can't live without destroying Trump. They hate him so bad right now. America is extremely divided, and it's disturbing to me, very disturbing. Charles Young said, you can't go through an interview and think you have to remain friends. This part I agree more with the person after the interview. If you tell the truth as you see it, and that is your sacred duty, many times you have to incur the wrath of the reader, the subject, and even the editor. But truth is the only thing that matters in this profession. You have to write without fear of consequences. I say that with a little bit of exception, is what I was talking about earlier with Anya dying for telling the truth. You have to set your own limits of where you draw the line as to how much truth you're willing to tell and what consequences you're willing to suffer for that. And again, he's an entertainment writer, so he can say this. He can say it kind of blanket. Nobody's going to kill him for saying something bad about a musician. From my video, I mentioned this is just through 2008, 722 journalists were killed around the world. Some of the most dangerous places to live or to do your job. Iraq at that time, because it was still a hotbed of. Russia is dangerous because they're corrupt. They have a lot of corrupt. Which one? Yeah, well, this is as 2008. It could have gotten worse or better. I don't know. Yeah. So it's anyway. So it can be a dangerous profession. Probably by now, the number of journalists killed is since that's more than 10 years ago. Probably well over 1,000 who have been killed since 1992. Yeah. I guess this is that the one I showed you before? I think so. Again, another conference I went to, and again another 400 photos to get that one to focus on. So don't be afraid to take a lot of photos and think about where you should take them to go with your story. It's really important to have good photos and other art possibly with your stuff. And so think about that. And like I said, more is better. It's kind of like what was said in that video yesterday about you never have enough B-roll. In this case, you never have enough digital photos. Again, I think that was the one I showed previously. A lot of people would be running. This was the governor of Washington State. Be running a picture of her smiling at the camera. That's not what I do. That is not, to me, that is not a journalistic photo to put in a photo of somebody smiling at the camera. So I want to capture them as natural as possible, whoever they might be. Just some other. So I just give you an idea. Okay, well that's the end of that PowerPoint, and we're out of time. So do be thinking about what you want to write about. First come, first served on our list there. If I pass the list around, if you don't know what you want to write about yet, the longer you take, the more likely somebody else to take your good idea. So it won't actually be due until basically about the time I finish my teaching, I give it over to Godzilla. So let's see if May 8th is the fourth week, so 15th would be the fifth week. So somewhere around, I'll set a definitive time, but basically the end of May, maybe the first week of June, you'll want this story done, and then about that time, Godzilla will take over, and you'll be working on video instead. So it's never too early to start, deciding what you want to write about, and start getting some information, start setting up appointments. If you have 6 weeks or so. We're in the second week now, so you've got about 6 weeks to wrap this up. Um, a good excuse is not, I couldn't talk to her because she didn't have time to talk to me. Well, in 6 weeks, whoever that is you're trying to talk to has time to talk to you. She may not have time to talk to you the last day, but he or she has time to talk to you sometime in the next 6 weeks. So you should start soon to do your interviews, so that you can work on your story sooner and so forth, but also so you have no excuse for not getting the interviews done. You've got 6 weeks to do it. So there's no reason why you can't get your interviews done. And if you have to change interviews, you change interviews. If you have to change topics, you change topics. But um, you know, you're started now. You have one story to do in 6 weeks. I was doing 6 stories in 1 week. So you just have one story to do in 6 weeks. So start now, get it done. No excuses for going over deadline. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Well, then I think if you have no questions, I think that's all I needed to cover today. You now have my contact information. If you need to send me an email or anything, I will have this PowerPoint with my contact information on to Moodle by tonight sometime, so you know how to get a hold of me. Okay. Thank you. There's how many people are missing?